Hello and welcome to Foreign Policy Focus. This is episode 152 and I am the show's host Kyle. Joining me on today's show is Trey Weaver. Trey is the host of the Subversion Show, a great podcast that you also check out. Trey, welcome to the show. How are you doing?
Doing good. Thanks for having me on, Kyle. I'm so used to actually listening to your show when you're doing the interview, so that was a little strange for me.
Thanks, and I'm glad you tune in and listen. I brought Trey on the show today to talk a little bit about first, how he came to the ideas of anti-war, but to have a broader conversation on propaganda and how, while, the military is, if not the biggest budget, certainly after Medicaid and Social Security, it's going to cost Americans $1 trillion this next year. It's the thing that makes Americans most unsafe. It kills the most amount of people. And yet nobody cares about it and knows about it. Me and Trey here are going to try to figure out kind of why that is and go through some of the things that they do to make sure we don't really know what's going on. All right, so let's go ahead and start off with Trey. How did you come to the ideas of either non-intervention or anti-war?
Sure. So I came to become anti-war sort of by being a teenager during the Bush administration, sort of coming of age in the era of the War on Terror. So I saw this vast overreach of government use of violence in the military with the torture programs. I remember one of my formative memories was when I was in about 8th grade or 9th grade maybe, and the Abu Ghraib controversy came up. So that was just sort of a pivotal moment where I realized what was most important as far as issues going on in the world. So, I was raised sort of progressive, so that idea sort of coming up that the Bush administration was bad and war is bad just sort of cemented as I was, coming from adolescence to being an adult. So I thought that was the only way that you could be anti-war, was by being sort of a progressive. And then there's a guy named Ron Paul who came around and just beat the living hell out of Giuliani on the debate stage on cable TV. So that was really the moment that sort of woke me up to the ideas of libertarianism specifically, and that there were people who were against this terrible, the worst thing that government does, if we're being honest. That there were people on the right who were also anti-war. So that's sort of how I came to libertarianism, and I've really taken the anti-war stance as the most important issue to me ever since then.
Right. I want to go back a little bit to the Abu Ghraib and just what was it about that caused that really sparked the interest in you? Because the American government, unfortunately, commits a lot of atrocities, so I'm just kind of curious as to why that particular part of the Iraq War, created that feeling in you.
Yeah, I guess it was just seeing the pictures on the news of, you could tell what was going on with these people. There was some just major abuse, even from just the pictures that they showed you on TV of, people with cloaks over them and they're naked and, just the disgusting look that were on the people's faces who were the aggressors in that situation. And I just couldn't think of anything more viscerally just terrible than thinking about people who were doing that. So, it was just the imagery itself, I guess, more than anything.
Okay. Very interesting. And that you came at it from a progressive side, but then were convinced by Ron Paul. Is there any particular reason why maybe you didn't follow a progressive anti-war? I could think of plenty of principled people like a Glenn Greenwald or somebody though, and shifted over to the more, I don't want to say conservative, but libertarian approach, a small government approach to the anti-war message.
Well, I think the biggest thing was that my closest friends at the time were, becoming libertarians themselves, and I'm not sure how they were introduced to these ideas. But I suppose just my close friends being Ron Paulians and not Noam Chomskyites is really the big thing. Is that my social circle wasn't when we were coming of age. I guess we just diverted away from the progressivism in the intellectual sense at the time. And I also happened to come across a book by James Bovard, which sort of ties together the whole torture program and the whole my influence into conservatism, if you will, because Bovard is, I think he even writes for the American Conservative. He's kind of a constitutionalist right winger type, and I guess just actually hearing people out on that sort of end of the spectrum really had me thinking that the world's not as simple and binary as I had thought it was when I was younger, just from like watching The Daily Show and Comedy Central growing up. I just thought that it was the right thing to be a progressive. So there were many small things, I suppose, that worked into softening my view of the right and the potentials there.
Right. And, for anybody who doesn't know, Bovard's a great writer. He was actually on the Ron Paul Liberty Report today and did an interview with Dan McAdams just kind of about, I think, the FBI scandal. I'm only halfway through it. I only had 10 minutes on the way home from work to listen to it. But
I look forward to that. I didn't even see that yet.
Yep. Okay. So now I want to move into the ideas of propaganda, because I think most people come at it from a position where being an interventionist and being for American wars is more or less the status quo. That's how we all should be. But we have the opposite idea that this isn't a good thing, that it doesn't make Americans safer. And so, I guess you make the same assessment, Trey?
Absolutely. And, propaganda really is the underpinning of the entire war state. It can't survive without people at least being tolerant of it. So, we've sort of talked a lot off of camera here, just, about just the whole confusion of the propaganda that comes out, to where, I think most normal people who are apolitical and don't even care about a lot of these things, all they get are the little bits and pieces, and, without diving in and taking courses on the history of these regions and, even the conflicts that are happening right now would take a whole area of study to understand. So I think people just feel overwhelmed, and by those just little nuggets of manufactured truth, such as, weapons of mass destruction and the red line was drawn in Syria, those kinds of things just really, it doesn't take much, just talking points on the TV in the gym, as you're walking by. You might not even be paying attention, but it cements in your head just the simple idea that we're the good guys, they're the bad guys, and we're always overseas doing the good thing. So yeah, if I'm convinced that if we were to expose the truth to people, provided they'll actually listen, that's really the area of propaganda that we have a chance of winning the most converts, or at least being on the side of truth in that area. So yeah, propaganda really is the underpinning of the war state.
Right. I think for me at least, and how I have kind of developed and became anti-war, the most blatant symbolism for me has been the Syrian Civil War, and how in 2011 and 2003, Americans didn't want to go for the war. Obama let the Americans, decide, and all the polling was against it, and the resolution wasn't going to pass Congress. And yet, just a few years later, and we've conducted tens of thousands of airstrikes in Syria, and now have 2,000 troops that are going to perpetually occupy the country. And so, it's just amazing to me how we could have gotten from one place to another, where by default, Americans didn't want to do it. They said, I don't know anything about Syria. All those people look the same to me. I can't even decide what, side to take in it. They all point to the other side and say, that person is Hitler. So I don't know. Let's just stay out of it. And yet somehow, it's only 5 years later, right? How do we get from one to the other? Yeah,
I don't know. And you can see a lot of parallels between Syria and Iraq. I mean, just the the whole perception of there just being this one despot and he's the ultimate supreme ruler of the region, that's a really big hole is kind of blown in that once the regime is overthrown. You see all of these insurgent or all of these sectarian groups come up and start warring with each other over the power vacuum that's created. And you see that I don't think things are so simple as just Saddam ruled over his people and killed his own people with chemical weapons and all that kind of stuff, which, by the way, while we're on the subject of propaganda and lies and everything like that, that's one thing that people take for granted. But we were actually friends with Saddam at this time when Reagan was in office, and we were buddies with Saddam when he was killing his own people. We didn't seem to mind then when he was our ally. So, I mean, these are just the little things that we're going to talk about today that really just shine a light on the terrible injustice that is the information war. For as much as I don't like Alex Jones, he has an aptly named show in that really the war that we are fighting anymore is a war over data, a war over information.
Right. I mean, the first time I read 1984, one of the things to me that seemed impossible to believe was the idea that they could just change who they were at war with. We were at war with Eurasia. We've always been at war with Eurasia. And it just, changes throughout the novel 2 or 3 times to where they're allies with Eurasia now and at war with whoever else. And, it's amazing to me, that's actually kind of the case. I mean, if you look at what's happened, Iran and Iraq were enemies for a long time. And so after the Iranian Revolution in 1979, Saddam Hussein became an ally of the United States to counter the government we didn't like in Iran. And then, when 1991 or so came around with George H.W. Bush, we decided that wasn't the case anymore and that we were no longer friends with Iran or Iraq. And, these things just magically change, and it seems so unbelievable.
Yeah, I mean, even just consider a big one that everyone knows about is World War II with Russia. We were buddies with Russia up until the end of World War II, and then the Cold War came around, and they were the most evil group of people on Earth. So I just don't understand how they get people on the hook so easily. I guess that's what we're exploring here today.
Right. I think one of the ways they do it is they do not go beyond exploiting children. And Trey came up with a pretty cool clip. Well, not cool. Pretty awful, but in the same way, it's a great example of this. And this is during the middle of the Syrian Civil War. We have a young 7-year-old Syrian girl appear on CNN, and I'm just going to play her performance for you here.
Bana, do you blame President Assad for this?
Yes.
What is your message to President Assad?
I am very sad. A lot of died and no one helped them. The world is watching. The world doesn't do anything.
What do you want the world to do?
I want to stop the war, and I want the children of Syria play and go to school, live in peace. Together we can help them. Together we can save them.
Bana, when you saw the video and the pictures of what happened in Syria this week, what did you think?
I am very sad about this. 100 Syrians were killed in Syria. They were not terrorists. They were just people. Let me ask you, this didn't start today, but it has been going on for 6 years. Why can't you stop the war?
I don't know, Bana. I don't know why the world can't stop the war in Syria. Bana, Do you want to be able to go home to Syria someday?
Yes, I love my home and I love Syria.
All right, Trey. I think what we, just listened to was incredible. Do you want to kind of break it down and just explain? I know my listeners don't have video, but explain it a little bit.
Yeah. So essentially, CNN got a hold of this interview with this little girl. Her name's Anna, I believe. She's 7 years old, and it seems to be speculated that she and her family may be associated with this infamous White Helmets group that will definitely come up a couple of times during this interview here. But basically, if we're going to, I think we have a clip ready for an interview with an expert who analyzes this, don't we, Kyle?
Well, I can't quote directly from her tweets because I'm blocked, but by a 7-year-old. Well, she's now 8-year-old. But at the time when she opened her Twitter in late-ish, like September or so 2016, she was a 7-year-old girl living in eastern Aleppo, and she started tweeting how she wanted peace and how, Assad was bombing Aleppo. She tweeted something about Holocaust Aleppo and we need World War III. She was presented to us as this child that was suffering in war and was tweeting about her life in amazingly good English for a 7-year-old girl, even if she was a native English speaker, I have to say. And so after some time, like a month or two, her followers on Twitter skyrocketed to hundreds of thousands. And by the time that Aleppo was being liberated, she was tweeting along with other social media activists. This may be my last tweet. I don't know if I'll make it out alive. There was actually a Syrian journalist, Maitham al-Askar, I think his last name is, and I believe it was him. He was trying to get in touch with the family to say, look, we will guarantee you safe evacuation. I can't remember much more to his investigation, but he basically deduced they were there in eastern Aleppo, but they refused to be via him or by his contacts safely evacuated. But in the end, anyway, when terrorist factions were taken from eastern Aleppo and given safe military escort and passage to Idlib. So that's another point, is the Syrian government honored its promise, and the Russians, to allow these terrorists, Al-Qaeda, to leave Aleppo and go to Idlib, and then they went on, most of them, to Turkey. Bana's family went with them. And Bana ended up in Turkey, met Erdogan, took a nice photo with Erdogan, got Turkish citizenship. And while she was there, she was interviewed by a South African man, maybe with the Young Turks, don't quote me on that, but definitely a South African man who said, now Bana, you might not understand my English, so I will speak slowly, and you have, your mother and someone else to help you. And his first question to loosen her up was, do you like the food in Istanbul? And she said, guess what? Save the children of Syria. Which is a pretty strange answer.
One more time, sorry.
Save the children of Syria. To do you like the food in Istanbul? Then the guy followed up and he said, Bana, do you like Istanbul? And in the meantime, her mother said in Arabic, what do you like to eat, Bana? So she said to the question, do you like Istanbul? She said, fish.
Yeah, we have essentially this, Eva Bartlett explains that this is essentially, it's sort of taking only one angle of the perception here, because as we'll see in this clip, the interviewer off camera had asked her, is the food good in Istanbul? And then the little girl replies something to the effect of, save all the children in Syria, or something completely unrelated. So it seems to me that the little girl, English is her second language or third language, whatever it happens to be, and that she may not even actually understand the questions that are being asked of her. So it seems like she's just playing the role of an actor in this sort of war theater.
Let's see. Right on. And I think you had some other evidence against or about the White Helmets, Trey, that you want to talk about. A pretty good Guardian article that came up not too long ago.
Yeah, it's lovely. And, this was only recently brought to my attention again because I only recently started listening to the Corbett Report, which is it's hosted by a guy named James Corbett, and actually Pat from Liberty Weekly had introduced me to his show. And anyway, roundabout way of saying, he ends up actually he's doing this fake news award ceremony on his show, right? And then this article he says wins the fakest fake news story of the entire year. So we'll link to it in the show notes, I would imagine, and you can read for yourself just the superficial nature of this entire article. Is just it's really sort of silly. Like, this is the propaganda wing of the war state in its full exposed state. I mean, they're calling this organization, they use the word humanitarian over and over. They denounce anybody who says anything bad about the White Helmets as conspiracy theorists and anti-imperialist activists and agitators, and all of these words that, as we'll come to talk about in this episode, there are just certain ways that words are framed in order to spin narratives. And this really, this isn't a great revelation, but this is the most important part to pay attention to those kinds of things. Because the White Helmet is being portrayed as this benevolent organization that's only out there helping people. But, even their leader, what's his name? Rahid al-Assad or al-Salah, has ties to terrorist people who are known organizers of al-Nusra and
there's Al-Qaeda in Syria, which is just al-Nusra rebranded. Al-Nusra has since rebranded itself as Tahrir al-Sham and
that's the
HTS as well, which I believe is Tahrir al-Sham. Those are, the Syrian rebel groups, and this I think was under direction of Zarqawi, has rebranded themselves several times in order to try to get more weapons from the United States government.
Yeah, and
also to mention
go
about the White Helmets real quick was just the White Helmets, have known ties to Al-Qaeda or, al-Nusra or whatever you want to call the group of jihadists in Syria. And yet this is routinely the source cited by international groups like UN reports on Syrian chemical weapons, and also on reports just a couple weeks ago on CNN. I read a report where they cited that the number of deaths that was given to them by the White Helmets.
Yep.
It's like, after 6 years, the CNN is supposed to be the greatest news network ever, doesn't have a source better than Al-Qaeda in Syria. It's absolutely baffling.
Yeah, and if the readers will, or the listeners will read through this article, like I said, it's on full display. They pretty much come out and admit that what the benefit of this organization and why we should love the White Helmets is that they provide footage, on the ground footage, and they're the ones documenting all of the bad things that the Assad regime is doing. So what do you think as the enemy of this regime, how else are you going to, make it look like the Assad regime's worse? You can have this organization that's on the ground documenting all of the bad things that the Assad regime is doing, and they are actually themselves part of the rebel group and part of the insurgency that's trying to fight the Assad regime. So it'd be no surprise to learn that they only are covering the crimes of the legitimate regime in Syria. Al-Salah's right-hand man, his name is Mustafa you guys will all have to excuse me, I'm not Arabic, so I can't pronounce these, but his first name's Mustafa. So Mustafa has pled allegiance to
HTS.
So basically they're the rebranded al-Nusra, Al-Qaeda's gun runners. So he's sworn loyal to them, and he's like he's the White Helmet's main media manager. So this is the guy who is who was the front and center of their Twitter presence, more or less, this whole time, and he is avowed to these rebel groups. So, I mean, there's really no escaping it, but there's no mention of any sort of ties like that or any of the good arguments made by the people who are raising an eyebrow at the white helmets. So yeah, I mean, this article is just full of them. I mean, by framing it, for example, let me just take one paragraph out of this whole article. I'll just scroll through and grab a paragraph. White helmets play two roles in Syria. The first is their rescue work, providing an ambulance service, fire service, and, sort of rescue infrastructure, if you will. And their second role is documentation, taken within the country. So there you see it. Like, they just come right out and say that their half of their asset is the information asset.
Absolutely. And the real consequences of this is that they take all this white helmet information, change it into American propaganda, and feed it to Americans, and now we have Americans dying in Syria. We have, more death and destruction in Syria. It's been absolutely brutal and long civil war fueled by American propaganda that made the American citizens complacent on American interventionism in the country. Another time where that happened very blatantly, as we mentioned, was Iraq with the WMDs. And I just want to go back and play a clip from George W. Bush, and I believe this is in 2002 in the lead up to the Iraq War, correct, Trey?
Yes, it was it must have been right before they authorized use of force in Iraq, because he's basically saying that we can't wait for the final okay.
Some citizens wonder, after 11 years of living with this problem, why do we need to confront it now? And there's a reason. We have experienced the horror of September the 11th. We have seen that those who hate America are willing to crash airplanes into buildings full of innocent people. Our enemies would be no less willing. In fact, they would be eager to use biological or chemical or a nuclear weapon. Knowing these realities, America must not ignore the threat gathering against us. Facing clear evidence of peril, we cannot wait for the final proof, the smoking gun that could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Okay, Trey.
Yep.
Wow. I mean, looking back at that, I don't know what my reaction would have been at the time if I was old enough to understand it. But looking back at it and what's happened since that time, it's absolutely jaw-dropping. To hear him say, we couldn't wait for the evidence that Iraq had WMDs before going in, which has completely turned the Middle East on its head. It created an Islamic State. It's empowered Iran. It's pretty much, the cause of everything going on in Syria, partly in Libya. And it turns out the WMDs weren't there. So, I mean, what do you say about this? This is like fear-mongering at its pinnacle.
Yeah, and I mean, this is a really important clip to bring up, to expose to people, because I only recently got into it with a neocon right-winger who was trying to defend the siege in Iraq, and I was saying something about, there was no evidence of any kind of nuclear program or anything like that, and that the aluminum tubes was all just trumped up nonsense. And he said, "Oh, well, they were never worried about nuclear weapons. They were worried about chemical weapons." And so, that I've heard that more than once by people who try to sound like they know what they're talking about and what was going on at the time. But, you hear it in right here in this speech. He says, "We can't wait for the smoking gun. It's going to come in the form of a mushroom cloud." And when you say weapons of mass destruction, you're not thinking of gas attacks in the trenches in World War I, you're thinking of like H-bombs dropping on whole cities and turning them into ash. You're not thinking about weapons that are just a little bit more effective than a ballistic weapon. You're talking about, city destroyers is I think what draws in people's minds. And I think I even remember Powell talking about Nigerian yellow cake uranium was another piece of evidence that they purported. So, I mean, the whole thing about it being all about chemical weapons, and then after the fact, they come and they find some Russian-era chemical weapons that were in storage somewhere because it was too dangerous to move. Then they use that to be like, oh yeah, this is what we were looking for the whole time. When, you would expect to see at least a caravan of a rolling lab of chemical weapons that they said that they were going to make, if they're going to go down that narrative that it was all about the chemical weapons. So yeah, I think it's just really important to highlight just the blatant lies that they use this most basic instinct in humans, and that is just the basic fear of your death in the most horrible way. I mean, getting an H-bomb dropped on your city, that sounds terrible. So, I mean, to just use the American people in that way, I just find very disgusting.
Right. That's a great point, Trey. The other thing I would just point out about the Iraq War is that, we're all these years later, and as you were pointing out, there's somebody recently saying that, Saddam still had WMDs. And so it's not like these lies ever go away. Even after, several Syrian chemical weapons attacks have been proven to be false flags, every time any rebel white helmet anywhere says, Assad dropped some chlorine on us, the American mainstream media will run with the story without question, knowing full well that this could provoke a war between the United States and the Assad government, likely provoking a war between the United States and Iran and Hezbollah, and possibly provoking a war between the United States and Russia, all for some fake lie. It's incredible. And then I guess the other piece of that too is just that these people all haven't been forced into shame, right? It's not like every time one of these people goes on the mainstream media, everybody else doesn't point to they're a Nazi, right? Or point out the horrific war crimes they committed, right? Every time Matt Spook goes on Fox News, it's not like Rachel Maddow is on air the next day going, oh my God, this is the man who has, advocated for the killing of well over 1 million Iraqis at this point and wants to kill another 1 million Iraqis. This horrid person gets to talk on Fox News after being wrong about everything day after day. But yet, if somebody maybe from the alt-right goes on who, has pretty horrific ideas, but at the same time, they haven't killed 1 million Iraqis and, they're just some wingnut with a pretty small following, then everybody's doing an expose on it. And I'm not saying that nobody should care about, a Richard Spencer going on TV, but look at the proportions, people. Look at all the damage that John Bolton and Matt Spoot and the rest of, the Bill Kristol neocons and the rest of them. I mean, they provoked a war in Ukraine that the United States is now fighting on the side of Nazis with. This is Victoria Nuland and Robert Kagan, right? These are all the people that have been wrong about everything that has led to millions of people dying, Americans backing and making a more unsafe war for themselves, and they get to go and say anything they want at any time, and nobody cares. And I guess, moving on to the last conflict that I think we want to talk about, that is the war in Yemen. And this is the one that there's not people on air advocating for all the time. It's the one that nobody's paying any attention to.
Yeah, and before we get to Yemen, I do want to just stay on that subject real quick and just say that not only are these people not ashamed, they shame you for being anti-war. You're the anti-American. You're the guy who wants to defend Assad while he kills his own people. They completely turn it around on you. I actually heard this term by SJWs recently that I didn't realize that it was such a potent term, but it's called gaslighting, where you're really in the wrong, but you're actually making it seem like the other person's just out of their mind and not thinking clearly about the situation. So the war propagandists have this under lock and key. I mean, how can you be against, like, and the historical example, going back to that, is always there. They always kind of bring up, oh, well, we should have, what if we wouldn't have gotten involved and invaded Germany and got Hitler? When in reality, Hitler didn't actually start his mass executions until we invaded Germany, and he felt like he was in a corner. So anyway, just to stay on that sort of tangent that we were on, I wanted to get that point out. And then, yeah, just to get to the point about Yemen, that's one of the worst conflicts going on in the world right now. And I mean, if this were happening in Syria, if Assad were being very, like, let's say he put a blockade on some port on his border, what would be the response? We would be saying that he's killing millions of people and exacerbating a cholera epidemic and all of this stuff. I mean, what would the war propagandists say about what we're not only just turning a blind eye to the Saudis doing, but ourselves being the instrumental piece of the blockade, enforcing the blockade on Hodeidah. So, yeah, I mean, and this is one that I can't even get people's attention for it, let alone to debunk any sort of propaganda, because they're not even paying attention to it. And when they do, all they're saying is basically that, at worst, they'll say the U.S. is making the war worse. They don't say that this is America's war, which it is. They just sort of say that we're on the fringes of this and, we're just sort of casual bystanders letting it happen or something, when the truth is really a lot darker.
Right. I mean, the usual response is, shrug, and then somebody starts going on about healthcare or whatever other, domestic topic they want to rail about, or, whatever ridiculous thing like the Super Bowl. So I think the other thing that me and Trey want to do on this show is run through some of the, most commonly used propagandist words. The first category I put together are the words that make the war sound not so bad. So whenever you hear them talking about the way we kill terrorists, we do it in surgical strikes, precision strikes. There's something called a signature strike, which means just bombing the same place twice, but waiting for all the, parents to come rushing to save their children, and all the EMTs rushing in to save the children, and then we blow it up again. And then they use words like, we have advanced guided munitions, or these are tactical strikes or raids. So what do all those words make you think of, Trey, and what are they in reality?
Well, I suppose, knowing what I know, it strikes a sort of weird feeling in my gut, like just sort of visceral fear, or not fear, but just discomfort with the thought that those are the words that are used to describe these actions. Because in reality, as both of us know, the strikes that are made in the drone war have up to 90% casualty rates of unintended targets. So yeah, I mean, in reality, there's nothing surgical. There's nothing precision about strikes where we're just basically killing maybe a terrorist, and maybe even a terrorist that he was a terrorist because his dad's dead because, we drone bombed him when he was 14 or something. But yeah, then you also kill all the neighbors and everything. So, I mean, when's the price not worth it for these people? And, how can we get the word surgical and precision at least taken out of the equation? I just don't even know.
Right. I was just reading a story yesterday about some girl, I think she was 13 at the time, had half her face and her arm blown off by one of the U.S. drone strikes, and they refer to it as a precision or a surgical strike. And it's so then did you mean to blow off her face? Is that the policy of the U.S. government now, that it's we could blow off 3 little girls' faces in exchange for 1 big bad terrorist. What? Who's making those calculations? It's just it's so disgusting.
Yeah, man.
I remember.
And I just want to say, I've actually talked to a drone pilot before, and when I brought up this troubling aspect of the drone war, you know what he told me? He told me that there's no such thing as innocent people in these wars, that those aren't just, they aren't just collateral damage. He even went as far as to say that they're all guilty because they're taking up the security of ISIL or something, So, I mean, this is really, and really honestly, can you really blame the guy? He's the one driving the drones around. He probably doesn't want to have to think that these people that he's blowing up are actually innocent. And, yeah, man, it was just a really heartbreaking conversation to have that with a person, like a human being, another human being that does that for a living. Like he's playing a video game, man, and just blowing people up. And he doesn't think that there's such thing as innocent people in this game.
And that's not far off of, as terrible as it is, it's not that far off of the official U.S. policy. Remember, under the great humanitarian and, caretaker of people of color, Barack Obama, he had a policy for the United States drone war that was any fighting age male was guilty unless proven otherwise. So if, you were a 15-year-old in Yemen and you got blown up, you were a terrorist. And that was U.S. policy, right? And this is, like I said, supposed to be the Nobel Prize winning great humanitarian. I was reading a story about Afghanistan that I will link to in the show notes. I think it was by Jeong. And she talked about how in Afghanistan, when a drone flies over, all the men scatter. That way, if they decide to bomb one of them, they don't kill all of them. And this is just like routine in their country now. That if you hear the buzz of the drone, you get, 200 feet away from the nearest guy. That way you don't get blown up.
See, and that's just this kind of stuff that if you tell people that kind of story and they don't have the same visceral reaction, you just wonder what their value system is. Because hearing that to me, like, man, that's like the worst thing I can think of. Like, I'm a freaking American, man. I mean, I worry about, if someone were to be brandishing a weapon in public, I'd be freaked the fuck out. But if it were drones flying and this were a daily thing that I would have to take cover at, 10 in the morning and 2 o'clock in the afternoon every day when the drones make their rounds, I mean, whew, yeah, tough to think about.
Absolutely. The next group of words I want to go over kind of papers over and allows the Americans to get away with people not killing or caring about who's killed. And they use labels like terrorist, insurgent, and militant. It now seems to be a very popular one. So what do you think of those words and how they're used?
Well, I guess to talk about insurgent specifically, I often say to right-wingers that if someone were to bomb us in America, you would see a lot of, and they were trying to initiate regime change, they would end up being called Christian insurgents because there would be Christian people who would take up arms with their Christian bodies and go and kill people with Christian bullets. And they would be called insurgents at that point, I'm sure, by the invading force. So, I mean, just to put things in perspective, think about if you were in that situation. That's just how I have to frame these things to normal people. And that calling them things like insurgent doesn't, it doesn't make it any better to me. And then, yeah, I mean, terrorist, pivotal, or a very key word in this war on terror, I suppose. You just call someone a terrorist, just how in the McCarthy era, in the Cold War era, if you called someone a communist, that was a pretty easy way to denounce them. So, yeah, just toxic words that are used for a toxic policy.
I think the worst one, the group, is militant, because militant has pretty much just come to mean guy with a gun. So now you have people dying in Afghanistan and Yemen that are suspected militants. So you are suspected to have a gun and you got blown up by a U.S. bomb. It's, the way everything gets classified, but yet calling them a suspected militant, their life means nothing. You know what I mean? It's not 30-year-old guy on his way to work to feed his wife and kids. They never say that. They never point out that, this is, so-and-so who was, just off to pick up his kids from school. Or this was the school that got bombed. It was all, collateral damage. Civilians is the most heavy-handed word the media will ever use to describe these people. They rarely, unless Assad, Russia, or Iran is killing somebody, they will never say children. And so, it's just these key words that allow all the dehumanization to go on.
Well, and juxtaposed a word like militant with a word like freedom fighter, because depending on who our ally is at the time and what our aims are, they could be a militant or a freedom fighter, So that's what they were calling. That's what a BBC documentary was calling the rebel groups in Syria, before they became the bad guys.
Right. Well, they were Al Qaeda, but before they start chopping off people's heads and people actually knew, I guess.
Right.
All right. The next group of words I want to go over is kind of just the group that we go through to get us into these wars that we claim are for the goods of other people. So you have things like nation building, hearts and minds. Bush had mission accomplished. Obama had the surge worked. Peacekeeping and humanitarian interventionism are all kind of the sneaky words they use to make it sound like we need to go to war to help other people.
Right, and on the subject of specifically hearts and minds, what that brings to mind for me is just, you'll hear people, especially, neocon propagandists, they'll say, oh, well, I went over there and I talked to the women and, they want us to help them, to help liberate them. And there's like this sort of, feminist agenda that appeals to people. And you know what? It appeals to me, too. I don't like to see women coerced into, clitorectomies and, having to wear the full burqa and everything. But you also have to realize that a lot of these women, especially if they're deep into villages in Pashtunistan, they think that that's, they want to live that way. It is a source, it is a sense of identity to them to wear the burqa and, the whole thing. So I mean, what does it mean to win the hearts and minds of people? Well, I think when you hear stories like that of, the Arab women just want us to help them, and it's probably no surprise that the people that they're talking to are friendly to the regime, and so of course the ladies that are friendly to the U.S. soldiers and whatnot are going to tell you that they want the U.S. to liberate them because they've already come to that decision in their lives or in the conflict. You know what I mean? So yeah, I mean, just using that sort of deception and just playing on people's better nature, really, to have them support something that's so evil. It's just terrible.
I always thought nation building was kind of funny because it presupposes that there wasn't a nation there first a lot of times. And so you have this idea, like with the Iraq war especially, that after Saddam fell, we were going to go in there and build a nation. And this means we were going to install bridges and hospitals and schools and make this a really great place. Where before this was just a bunch of people living in desert huts, running around under some crazy warlord. But in reality, we destroyed the nation of Iraq and then tried to rebuild it, from the rubble, both from, Clinton's wars in Iraq and Bush's wars in Iraq. Similar situation, I guess, with the idea of peacekeeping, where, we say, oh, we're going to go here for a peacekeeping mission, but that means, we're going to put our guys with guns in the middle of other guys with guns, and this is somehow the way to keep the peace, or this, is an effective way to keep the peace. When a lot of times peacekeeping is just masquerading as occupation, kind of Israel with the Golan Heights and the occupied territories. And the last one, I always find it interesting how toxic the word nation building became, and that kind of bears the brunt for what went wrong in Iraq. Was that, the problem wasn't that we went and we killed 1 million people. The problem is that, we went and we killed 1 million people, and then we tried to build them a hospital. I don't know. I never get over that.
Well, and then nation building, that sort of plays into another group of words that you have here, which is like American values and democracy, because that's really what we're trying to do with nation building, right? Is we're trying to build like a Western democracy that, we're trying to like give them a jump start straight to the heart of Western values real quick. Try to put them through the Enlightenment in a hot minute, and yeah, I'm not sure why people keep buying it. I mean, it seems to me that before we started destroying these countries, they were becoming very cosmopolitan. If you hear stories about hippies that used to drive through through Afghanistan back in the day, I mean, you had your jihadist groups that you avoided, but most people, if your van broke down in the middle of the desert, they'd come and help you and give you food and stuff like that. So, I mean, it's no surprise that humans are humans all throughout the world, and it just seems to encourage bad behavior, both economic and just behavioral, when you go and try to overthrow the order and regime in a country, and that's what we call nation building, is destroying nations.
I talked about this a little bit on the last show, just the idea that they say we're protecting American values and interests, but we've killed over 1 million innocent people, and so if American values and interests allow us to carry out an aggressive war in countries that results in 1 million people dead, you would have to think that at some point you would have to, evaluate whether that's something you should value or not.
Yeah.
And
absolutely. If murdering, millions of people every year is what it takes to ensure American values, then I guess we should abandon them.
Right, and so before we wrap up, there's just a couple more of these groups we want to get to, and that is how they name the weapons. If you look, they have the Predator and the Reaper drones, which I guess at least are scary. They didn't name, like Angel and something else to make them sound harmless. But you have things like Tomahawk missiles, the A-10 Warthogs. I think like some of the F-22s are Lightnings and some of them are Eagles. And, they just have all these very clever names that makes the, tanks sound really cool. And I think it's probably mostly directed at the guys to get them into it, so they could talk about, how cool America's new fighter F-35 is, or, how awesome the Predator drones that deliver the Hellfire missiles to people are. But when you look at it from the other perspective, that our Marines are known as Devil Dogs, and that Reaper drones bring Hellfire missiles to your village, that has to, like, what kind of propaganda is that works against the United States and directly for the jihadists?
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think you hit the nail on the head that really naming the bombs the way that they do certainly appeals to just that macho sort of mentality of the military, and really gets people all kinds of fired up about dropping bombs on people. I mean, it's kind of strange too, because I really like guns, so I can kind of see like the whole like, naming guns something cool and dangerous sounding makes the gun just that much more awesome. So I'm sure the way that these guys see bombs is pretty much the same way. I'm sure the way that the Air Force guys see the way that they're going to go and drop some Warthogs or whatever, Moabs, mother of all bombs. I'm sure that one was fun for the boys to drop. So I mean, you can see as just another dude, right? That could appeal to you. I think you were in the military, weren't you, Kyle? Oh, okay. Sorry, I must be getting you mixed up with someone else. But anyway, but yeah, you can see how it would play to the boy inside of you, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And as a little kid, I thought it'd be the coolest thing in the world to be a fighter pilot. And my views have changed a little bit. The last thing I want to talk about is it kind of ties in with one of the first ones, but just the idea that they say, we're bombing Arab or Muslim countries. And it seems to me like nobody in the United States, our view of people kind of in the Middle East, in the greater, Muslim world, is that they all kind of look like a Saudi, and they all, worship, Muhammad equally. And there's, if people have a more advanced view of the Muslim world, is that the Sunnis don't like the Shia and that's it. But there's never like real conversations about it. And so I think that's one of the things that's been very unfortunate about U.S. mainstream media, is that we've been fighting these wars with the Middle East for 16 years. And yet you don't see anybody, even the people on the left who maybe you would think would profile these a little more human interest values, just going around and, interviewing a couple people in Libya and then a couple people of Egypt and then a couple Palestinians and, trying to like bring all these people into our homes because, there's giant mountains, like the Himalayas run through Pakistan. It's not a desert. Yet, anybody from Bangladesh to Morocco apparently looks like a Saudi. So I always find that interesting.
Yeah, they've managed to really make the whole Middle East sound like it's just one place, and including like Northeast Africa as well. I mean, Libya is sort of considered within the nexus of the Middle East because it's within that same region, but yeah, I mean, these places are even within the nations themselves have so many different groups of people with a totally unique culture. I mean, just mentioning the name Afghanistan, for example, literally means land of the Pashtun, and the Pashtun people are the 40% majority there, and that is what makes up the Taliban. They are the Pashtun insurgency source in Afghanistan. And what America is doing is actually backing the 10% minority of northern tribes who seem to be more aligned with India's interests. So yeah, I mean, if you actually were to even get, and like I've told you before we even hit record, Kyle, I get a little worried that I don't even know enough about all these things, but even just reading a little bit about just some of the different groups and how complicated things really are over there, as far as the divisions between people, and that Islam is not a monolithic sort of cultural force. Yeah, I mean, things are just so much more complicated than we're being told in the media, and even the sort of progressive types who are more inclusive and try to portray Islam in this sort of more positive light, I don't think they themselves even are coming at this from a genuine place of trying to understand or anything like that. They're just trying to sort of suit their own sort of propaganda goals themselves of making themselves look like the white knights, when really they don't seem to have much interest in helping these people at all because they're not really anti-war. So they're not for getting out of these countries and stop destabilizing them. So I'm not sure, what kind of concern they even have for them.
Well, that's a great point. I think a good place to wrap up the show. I think we're a little over an hour now, Trey. So thanks so much for coming on. Where would you like to send people who would like to check out more of your work?
Well, I host a show called Subversion, and I release episodes. I try to get them out on a weekly basis, but I'm a very busy person, so I've been sticking to at least every other week. So you can find me at subversionwebcast.com, facebook.com/subversionwebcast. Find me on any podcatcher of your choice. Just search Subversion, sans the webcast. Don't try to search that. You won't find it.
All right. Thank you so much, Trey. And if you want to find this show to share with, which I'm sure me and Trey would both very much appreciate, foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com, thelibertarianinstitute.org, or the Facebook page, The Libertarian Union, where, like Trey said, you can also find his show. And I'm on Twitter at KYAAALE. Thanks so much for coming on, Trey.
Thank you for having me.